He was notorious across the Texas range. A wealthy, cold-hearted cowboy who ruled his vast ranch with a hard edge and a sharper tongue. No one dared question him, least of all the loyal maid who quietly served his every need for years. But when that very maid mysteriously vanished one night, taking nothing but a precious silver keepsake, he guarded like his own soul. His frosty world began to crack. Why would the most obedient servant steal the one thing he could never replace with money? And could the cowboy find the answers, or would old secrets and hidden pains unravel everything he'd built? Stay with us to see how this daring theft sets off a chain of events that changes both lives forever. Trust us. You won't want to miss the final twist in this tale of pride, regret, and the power of love. And while you're here, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you more captivating stories you won't find anywhere else. They called him the Frost Baron of Texas, a man whose legendary riches matched the chill in his disposition. Grant Morgan had clawed his way from near ruin to affluence, erecting a ranching empire so vast that his name alone could send tremors through bank offices and county halls. To outsiders, he appeared unassailable, a figure who reduced all problems to tidy columns of profit and loss. But on the sprawling estate he called home, only one person glimpsed the faintest suggestion of something more human within him. Ivy Parker, his quietly efficient maid of nearly 15 years. Ivy saw it in the way Grant sometimes touched a hidden silver pendant whenever he executed an especially harsh foreclosure. In that moment, his impassive mask would slip just enough for her to wonder what secrets lay behind his glacial demeanor. She had learned to read Grant's imperceptible changes in mood, the faint tension in his shoulders when he opened a letter bearing bad news, the slightly clipped tone he used when dealing with employees who disappointed him. Like the routine of sunrise, Ivy served his morning coffee black, placed at the right-hand corner of his vast mahogany desk, precisely when the Texas light began filtering through the bay windows. She knew better than to inquire about his business decisions. She'd once seen him ice over a stable hand who merely suggested a gentler approach to managing difficult horses. From that day on, Ivy understood that suggestions, whether kindly meant or not, would not be tolerated. And yet, for all his severity, Grant had a ritual that baffled even the staff. Late at night after brandy by the fireplace, he would slip a hand inside his vest pocket and clutch that silver pendant. It was a fleeting gesture. Any observer could miss it if they blinked. Ivy, keen-eyed from years of noticing the smallest details, never missed it. Once she even peeked at the pendant when it lay unguarded on a table. It bore a faint inscription, barely legible. She could not make out the words, but she sensed it was tied to a heartbreak or betrayal that fueled the man's rigid armor. That morning, after placing his coffee, Ivy returned with a letter for Grant's approval. A family named Reyes had sent another plea for an extension on their mortgage payment. Grant waved it aside with cool disinterest. Burn it, he ordered, his voice as crisp as wind through a winter orchard. If they had time to compose tearful epistles, they had time to work harder. Ivy gave a slight, respectful nod, then withdrew. Pocketing the letter, she had grown accustomed to seeing pleas like these, often containing photographs of hopeful children or stoic parents. Like so many before it, this one would likely end up fueling the next morning's fire. But she wasn't always so obedient. Over the years, Ivy had collected dozens of letters and pictures that Grant had dismissed. She kept them hidden under the loose floorboard in her modest attic room, a silent testament to the human stories behind the stark black lines of Grant Morgan's balance sheets. Sometimes after the moon rose, she would take them out and wonder about the man who could so easily dismiss such pleas while keeping a tiny silver pendant tucked close to his heart. It made her question whether the Frost Baron of Texas was a title he had claimed for himself, or if someone's absence had forced him to adopt a hardness he could no longer relinquish. Ivy's private domain was a small, sparsely furnished attic room perched at the rear of the main house. She had a single window that overlooked the distant cattle fields. At dusk, she often stood there watching the silhouettes of ranch hands guiding the herd back to the barns. Whenever her duties paused, she would open her mother's old prayer book, a family keepsake in pencil in her observations of Grant Morgan's empire. She wrote between the printed lines of psalms and hymns, filling the margins with careful notes. August 3rd. Mr. Morgan turned down yet another extension. Showed no remorse, but later saw him alone, hand on the pendant. Flipping through the pages revealed an informal history of how Grant's ranch kingdom had expanded. She chronicled his acquisition of neighboring properties, the ones he bought from desperate families at well below market value, the owners forced to leave with little more than the shirts on their backs. Yet her notes also recorded fleeting glimpses of empathy. On one page, she had described a day when an injured colt lay whimpering in the stables. Everyone expected Grant to have the colt put down fast, cost-effective, and logical. Instead, he had knelt in the straw, coaxing the animal through the pain until a veterinarian arrived. Ivy ran her fingertips over that particular entry, a slight indentation in the paper where she had pressed harder with her pencil. He has not lost all warmth. Why does he keep it buried so deeply? She remembered that night clearly. After the veterinarian left, Grant had hidden in the shadows of the barn, turning the silver pendant in his fingers. A heartbreak, a mistake, an old promise. Over the years, she hypothesized many causes. Sometimes she wondered if he'd lost a wife or sweetheart. Others speculated he might have betrayed someone in his youth, and that guilt froze him from within. But Grant Morgan never spoke of it, and his staff knew better than to pry. With a sigh, she set aside the prayer book. Outside her window, Grant stood beneath the centuries-old oak that marked the property boundary. This was another ritual, his solitary twilight walk. She watched his posture, always so rigid, bend slightly as he placed a hand on the oak's scarred trunk. In that fleeting gesture, she detected a man weighed down by choices. Possibly regrets. The letters from the Reyes family lay stacked on her nightstand, an unwelcome reminder of how easily he dismissed pleas for mercy. Ivy removed a photograph she had steamed from the envelope. In it, a weary couple stood before a rundown barn with three bright-eyed children. They only asked for a little more time, she thought, yet Grant could not spare them even a moment of leniency. His empire, after all, had thrived under the principle that a debt is a debt, and those who cannot meet it must be sacrificed for the bottom line. Tonight, as always, she hid the photograph under the floorboard with the others, a growing mosaic of hopes crushed under the heel of Grant Morgan's ambitions. Maybe she mused if she ever discovered what was locked inside that silver pendant, she might understand how a man could stand so tall and yet remain so alone. But she did not suspect that soon, very soon, circumstances would push her to risk everything to find those answers and in the process unravel the carefully woven facade of the Frost Baron himself. A business meeting was scheduled for early afternoon. Alfred Tucker, a wiry rancher who came clutching an old newspaper clipping in one hand, Ivy watched from the threshold of Grant's study as Alfred pleaded his case. "My father and yours used to be partners, Mr. Morgan," Alfred said, voice quavering with pent-up frustration. "This clipping here shows you both standing together building new breeding programs for the region. He believed in you when you had nothing." Ivy glimpsed the photograph as Alfred held it out. A younger Grant, barely recognizable, smiled proudly beside Alfred's father, their eyes filled with optimism. Grant, however, remained unmoved. "That was 25 years ago," he said, flatly flipping the ledger pages as though that single piece of paper were infinitely more vital than old camaraderie. "Whatever arrangement existed then bears no relevance to the debts you owe now." He brushed aside Alfred's offer to negotiate. "Sell me your lands, or default entirely. The choice is yours, but do so quickly. I have no time for sentiment." Alfred's hands shook with anger and heartbreak. "My father gave you credit when no bank would," he hissed, dropping the clipping onto Grant's polished desk. "He had faith in you as a man who'd repay generosity in kind." "Where's that man now?" Grant's jaw tightened, and for an instant Ivy thought she saw his hand stray toward his vest, but he steadied himself. "He learned the world has no room for naive illusions," Grant replied tersely. "Now, if there's nothing else, show yourself out." Alfred's face twisted in helpless rage, but he left without another word. Quietly, Ivy stepped forward to retrieve the crumpled clipping. "Burn it," Grant ordered, his voice cold, like the rest. She nodded obediently, but she had no intention of doing so. Once Grant was distracted, she tucked the clipping into her apron. She had become something of a reluctant archivist, secretly preserving evidence of Grant's past. In her attic room, she would smooth out the papers and wonder if these were shards of a broken mirror that once reflected a kinder soul. While she collected the teacups and prepared to leave, she risked a final glance at Grant. He was alone now, shoulders slumped, though his facade remained carefully guarded. Sure enough, she saw him press a hand to his vest pocket, patting the outline of the silver pendant. But this time he slipped it out, turning it in his hands with an almost anguished expression. Ivy's heart pounded. She had never seen him openly hold it before. They'd always just the faintest caress through cloth. From her vantage at the door, she made out a fleeting glimpse. Inside the pendant was a tiny photograph, edges yellowed with age. It showed a beaming young woman beneath a large oak, her hand extended toward the camera, as though inviting the viewer into her joy. The sight was so unexpected, Ivy nearly dropped the teacup. She had always suspected the pendant was connected to a lost love, but this was real confirmation. Even so, the old Grant Morgan reasserted itself instantly. He snapped the pendant shut, replaced it in his vest, and resumed his stony demeanor. Ivy slipped out quietly. She already dreaded what would come next. Another ranch faced foreclosure. Another hopeful family was about to be cast aside by the man who clung to an image of a woman in a photograph, yet refused to show mercy to those living in the present. And so her hidden collection of family photos and letters continued to grow, each one telling a fragment of the tale Grant refused to read. Fury clashed like swords in the study. The following week, Clayton Summers, the estate's oldest ranch hand, stood stiff with outrage as Grant delivered a curt dismissal. "I've worked for the Morgans for over 30 years, Clayton pleaded. "Stood by your father when he nearly lost everything to a drought. You'd cut me loose now because my knees won't let me wrangle calves as fast as I once did." Grant's response was ice. "It's not personal. The ranch's efficiency matters more than personal history. I pay for skill, not loyalty." He twirled a pen in his fingers, ignoring the heartbreak lining Clayton's weathered face. "Collect your final wages from the accountant. You have until sundown to vacate the bunkhouse." Ivy, hovering in the entryway, felt her stomach lurch. Clayton was a kind soul, the one who'd shown her how to navigate the estate's hidden passages to avoid crossing Grant's path at inopportune times. He'd once bandaged her ankle when she twisted it on the rough stable boards. Now he stood there, hands shaking, eyes full of betrayed loyalty. "Your father wouldn't have done this," Clayton said in a trembling voice. "He valued folks who gave a piece of their life to keep this ranch running." Grant's expression hardened. "My father is no longer here, and neither is his sentimentality. This is the Morgan Empire now. My empire." He lifted his ledger meaningfully. "I track results, not years served." Clayton hesitated, then rummaged in his shirt pocket. He withdrew an old silver button, etched with the Morgan brand. "Your father gave me this when I saved his life. In the winter of '64, he muttered, placing it on the desk. "Said so long as I kept it, I'd always have a home here. Guess that was another promise you've chosen to break." For a moment, Grant froze, the hint of a tremor passing through his composure. His hand drifted toward his vest pocket, then snapped back. "Take it if you want," he murmured, pushing the button aside. "Means nothing to me." Clayton glared at Grant, turned and limped from the study. Ivy tried to catch his arm in the corridor, but he shook his head. "Don't waste your pity, Miss Ivy," he said softly. "Spend it on him. A man so desperate to snuff out every trace of kindness must be lonelier than any of us." When Ivy peered back into the study, she saw Grant pick up the silver button. He stared at it for a long moment, turning it over in his fingers. Then, with a hiss of repressed anger, he flung it into a desk drawer. In doing so, he accidentally knocked a matching teacup to the floor. The fragile china shattered, echoing in the silent chamber. The sharp crack reverberated through Ivy's chest like a warning. All these broken things, broken cups, broken promises, broken hearts floated in her mind as she watched him. 15 years of observation crystallized into a single thought. This man was punishing everyone around him for a sorrow he couldn't confront. Sorrow had calcified into cruelty, forging the legend of the Frost Baron. And yet there remained that silver pendant with the photograph of a smiling woman. Without it, perhaps he'd become fully consumed by bitterness. But the relic meant his heart was still in some small way alive. That night, Ivy made her decision. She would do more than watch from the sidelines. She would find that pendant and the truth behind it, even if it meant putting herself at risk. A crisp envelope bearing Ivy's letter of resignation lay on Grant Morgan's desk the next evening. Precisely folded, the note read, "I, Ivy Parker, hereby relinquish my position as head housekeeper of Morgan Ranch, effective immediately." No reason was stated. No farewell. Just the formality of departure. The mansion was eerily quiet at this late hour. It exhaled the usual creaks and murmurs of old timber settling in the cool Texas night. Down in the study, Grant sat with his usual brandy, reviewing the day's accounts. Unbeknownst to him, Ivy stood outside in the dark hallway, her heart pounding. She had watched him remove his vest, where the silver pendant always stayed, before he sank into his armchair with that final glass of liquor. This was the only time he removed it while awake. Within minutes, she surmised he would slip into his nightly reverie, staring into the fire with vacant eyes, her breath hitched. If she was ever to claim that pendant, it had to be now. She crept in, her footfalls lighter than a cat's. The vest hung from a brass hook behind the door. By the soft glow of the desk lamp, she saw Grant's broad back, still turned, his attention fixed on a ledger. She reached for the vest with a trembling hand, the pendant's contour visible through the fine wool. But then Grant spoke into the silence, startling her so badly that she nearly gasped. "I expected better from you, Miss Parker," he said, voice like a weary sigh. Her heart seized. She was certain he'd caught her. But he continued addressing her resignation letter instead, leaving in the night without a word after all these years. She froze her hand inches from the vest. He stared only at the letters, swirling his brandy. Just like a thief, the words sent chills down Ivy's spine. Yet he wasn't looking at her. He exhaled. "Very well. If that's the path you have chosen." In that split second, Ivy seized the vest, clasping the pendant tight in her fingers and slipping back into the corridor. She closed the door almost silently, moving on autopilot through the labyrinth of back stairs and hidden corners. Upstairs in her little attic room, her hands shook as she extracted the silver pendant and placed it alongside her well-worn prayer book. The intangible weight of her action pressed upon her. She had stolen the one item Grant Morgan cherished more than anything else on earth. She gave one last glance around the room where she had lived for 15 years. Her patch quilt remained on the bed, her mother's embroidered pillows on the armchair, a few personal trinkets on the windowsill. She took only her prayer book and the small box of family's letters and photos she had collected over time. Everything else would remain a silent testament to her abrupt departure. By the time the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, Ivy had vanished down the old service path behind the ranch, leading her horse by the reins. In her pocket, the pendant felt warm, as though it carried a piece of Grant's soul. She walked on, determined to learn the entire truth behind this memento and its long-lost significance. She feared the consequences if he caught her, but the memory of Clayton's dismissal, the heartbreak of the Reyes family, and the haunted expression Grant bore each time he touched the pendant emboldened her to act. She prayed that somewhere in unveiling his past lay a chance at redeeming the life she was leaving behind. Grant discovered Ivy's betrayal with the sunrise. Still wearing the same rumpled evening clothes, he stood in his study, vest in hand, realization twisting his features. The silver pendant gone. A red-hot fury and an inexplicable dread clashed inside him. How dare she? For 15 years she had been the invisible caretaker, never stepping out of line. Now she'd stolen the single heirloom that linked him to a time he both cherished and loathed. He flung open his desk drawers, rummaging for the map of the region. Glancing at the clock on the mantel, he knew she had at least a 3-hour head start. Fury roiled in his chest. In a single motion, he strode to the stables, ignoring the confused looks from the ranch hands. "Mount up, the lot of you," he ordered his foreman, Harvey Fletcher. "We have a thief to catch." Harvey, bleary-eyed, pulled on his boots. "Shall I wire the sheriff, sir?" he inquired. Everyone expected that to be the next step. Grant paused, uncertain. Legally it made sense, but something gnawed at him. Some vestige of guilt that dreaded an official manhunt. "No," he finally growled. "This is a private matter." He saddled the best tracking horse he owned, the map he crumpled into a saddlebag. He remembered how quietly Ivy had come and gone each day, how she'd escorted him, coffee at dawn, how her eyes lingered on him while he handled his ledger. She wasn't an impulsive woman. She would plan her escape route as meticulously as she had planned her housekeeping schedules. The ranch yard bustled to life under his bellowed commands. Horses were prepared. Men shouted directions, and soon they rode out in separate parties. Grant veered along a winding path behind the orchard, suspecting Ivy would avoid main roads. Daylight found him alone in a gully, dismounting to scan the ground for tracks. She was cunning. He found faint signs that suggested she led her horse through rocky areas to minimize hoofprints. His mind raced. Why would she do this? If she intended blackmail, she might simply run to the newspapers or to old enemies like Alfred Tucker. But that didn't ring true. Ivy had never shown interest in money or revenge. She was the caretaker, the quiet observer, the one who asked after the staff's well-being. In desperation, Grant thought of the letter he'd seen on her bed, her resignation. Just like a thief, he'd murmured the night before, guilt gnawed at him. Had he driven her to this? For 15 years, he had not once inquired about her personal aspirations, her dreams. He only expected her silent efficiency. Now that silence threatened to unearth the secret he guarded behind the pendant's photograph. Night fell without progress. Grant pitched a rough camp near an old creek bed. It had been years since he slept under the stars. Exhaustion tugged at his limbs, but he couldn't rest. He rummaged through his saddle bag for a piece of bread, and out tumbled a wrinkled letter, an old love note he hadn't realized was there. It was from Sylvia Thompson, the woman in the photograph. His hands shook as he traced her elegant handwriting. Memories flooded back how they had once walked these same hills dreaming of a ranch built on honest work, not cunning or subterfuge. He leaned back against a log, eyes on the sky. The pendant had been his last tangible bond to Sylvia. Her laughter, her ideals, her unwavering belief that wealth meant nothing without compassion. Now that bond was gone stolen by the one person in his household he'd never suspected capable of such an act. Yet behind the fury, a whisper of another possibility stirred. Perhaps Ivy had taken the pendant not to harm him, but to force him to finally face the pain he'd buried under a mountain of profit. Ivy coaxed her mare along a narrow forest track the next morning. The silver pendant felt heavy in her pocket, a constant reminder of the impossible lines she had crossed. She couldn't return to the mansion, nor did she truly want to vanish from Grant's orbit entirely. Instead, she aimed for an abandoned property, once known as the Thompson homestead. She'd found references to it among the old letters and documents she hoarded Sylvia Thompson's family estate, deserted for decades. She suspected it held clues to Grant's tortured history. At midday, she reached the homestead. It was as forlorn as the letters described: rotting fences, a decaying stable, and a main house whose roof sagged in places. Wild grasses had reclaimed much of the yard. Yet within the disrepair, Ivy sensed a tenderness in the broken porch swing, the remnants of a flower bed that had once been lovingly tended. She tied her mare to a post, approached the house, and eased open the front door. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, filtering through cracks in the roof. In the parlor stood a grand piano, its keys warped by time and neglect. On the mantel, an empty frame suggested that once a beloved portrait hung there. Ivy pictured a younger Grant side by side with a bright-eyed Sylvia beaming with hope for a shared future. But something went terribly wrong. The pendant's presence in Ivy's pocket felt almost accusatory. She wandered deeper into the house until she found a bedroom. Inside a bureau drawer, she discovered a small box containing old letters, many from Grant Morgan to Sylvia Thompson. They spoke of dreams to unite their ranches, to build a community that valued neighbors more than the bottom line. A promise that if they married, they would do better than the cutthroat tactics of previous generations. Tears pricked Ivy's eyes. The man who wrote these letters was no frost baron. He was hopeful, impassioned, believing love could overcome adversity. When did Grant forsake these ideals? One letter marked with a dark stain hinted at the break. Sylvia wrote, "You hide too many truths. My father confronted me with documents of your dealings, exploitations, cunning land purchases that left families in ruin. I cannot stand by and watch you twist honor into greed. I love you, but I cannot be part of this." Holding that letter, Ivy realized the heartbreak behind the silver pendant. Sylvia must have parted ways with Grant in disillusion, leaving him with a solitary photograph in the locket and an empire he built to prove himself after losing her. The knowledge made Ivy's breath catch in her throat. Outside, the wind picked up swirling leaves across the empty porch. Then she heard hoofbeats. Alarms spiked through her Grant's men. She hurried to the window, peering out at a lone rider approaching the homestead's perimeter. Even from a distance, his silhouette was unmistakable. Grant Morgan himself astride a tall, dark horse. The foreboding she felt was only tempered by the memory of the heartbreak she had uncovered. Ivy clutched the letters to her chest. If this confrontation was inevitable, then so be it. She would show him these relics of a kinder, gentler man. Perhaps that knowledge could save him, or perhaps he would simply unleash his legendary wrath and take back what she had stolen. Either way, the final act of this long-brewing drama was about to unfold among the shattered remnants of the Thompson homestead. Grant reined in his horse, a stone's throw from the sagging porch. The midday sun glinted off the broken windows of the Thompson house. His heart pounded at the memory of how proud Sylvia once was of these grounds. Time had ravaged them, just as it had ravaged the illusions of a bright future they'd planned. He spotted Ivy's mare tied near a tumbled-down fence. Through the murmur of the breeze, he could just make out the faint creak of the old porch swing. Tying his own horse, he strode toward the door. The rotted boards groaned under his boots, sending dust spiraling into the stale air. "I know you're here, Ivy," he called, voice echoing in the corridor. "You have something that belongs to Ma." Footsteps sounded in the parlor. Ivy emerged trembling, yet composed. In her hands was a sheaf of old letters. "It should never have belonged to you alone," she replied softly. "It belongs to the both of you, and maybe to everyone you've shut out over the years." Grant's gaze locked onto the letters. His handwriting, decades old, leapt off the pages. He felt exposed, as though his younger self stood naked before Ivy's judgment. "You rummaged through Sylvia's possessions?" he asked, a tortured edge to his voice. She was my sister, Ivy said, each word measured. I was away at school when everything fell apart. By the time I returned, she took ill and never recovered. But I read her letters. I know the heartbreak that turned you cold. Grant's shoulders sagged with shock. His eyes flickered from the battered walls to the dusty piano. Sylvia's sister, he murmured, repeating the phrase as if testing its truth. All these years, you worked in my household, witnessing my cruelty, and said nothing I needed to know. What truly happened, Ivy replied, voice trembling. Sylvia believed in the best of you. Even when she saw your questionable land deals, she prayed you'd correct your course. When you didn't, her spirit broke. I couldn't confront you until I was certain who you'd become. She took a step closer, holding out the silver pendant. I didn't steal this to harm you, Grant. I stole it, so you'd have no choice but to come face to face with your past. A chance to remember what you lost and what you still might salvage. His hand shook as he reached for the pendant. Inside the photograph of Sylvia remained the edges so worn from his constant handling that her face was slightly faded. He thought of how she once stood in that very spot, gazing at him with eyes full of hope. His mind replayed the bitter day her father had shown her, incriminating paperwork, revealing the cold cunning behind his acquisitions. She had ridden out in a storm, desperate to reverse some of his deals, only to return ill and eventually to pass away, all because she tried to reconcile her love for him with her moral compass. I told myself I had to be practical. Grant said, his voice barely audible, that the world favored the ruthless, not the generous. He swallowed eyes burning with emotion. Sylvia tried to show me otherwise. I refused to listen, and I lost her. Ivy gently placed a hand on his arm. You can't change the past, but you can still decide what kind of man you'll be now. Saliva's dream for you wasn't to rule over the powerless. She wanted you to build something real, something that lifted people up instead of crushing them. Grant stared at the silver pendant, Sylvia's image reflecting in his tear-filled eyes. I've spent my life trying to bury that dream in gold, he confessed, but maybe it's time to dig it up again. They reconvened at Ivy's modest cabin, perched just beyond the old homestead's orchard where she'd been staying. A small trunk in the corner held more letters and documents from Sylvia's final days. Grant sank onto a wooden chair by the fireplace, scanning these remnants of a life he had once planned to share. The close air smelled of cedar and dried herbs Ivy used for cooking. It was an intimate space, worlds away from the marble-floored halls of the Morgan mansion. Ivy brewed a pot of coffee on the iron stove. Outside, the sun hung low over the orchard, a patchwork of oranges and blues streaking the sky. I found your ledger, she said, returning to Grant with a battered binder. The records of your Empire Acres seized deals struck families displaced. I compared them to Sylvia's old notes, including the Reyes family's land. You're repeating a pattern she tried to stop. I think that's what finally broke her spirit, seeing you become exactly what she feared. He flipped through pages of typed text and neat figures, once his proudest accomplishments gleaned through merciless negotiations. Now the numbers felt like a chain dragging him under. I believed I had to be cutthroat. A man can't survive in Texas by being soft, he said defensively, though he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. Ivy nodded toward a map pinned to the wall, dotted with tacks of different colors. Softness has nothing to do with it. Compassion isn't weakness, Grant. It's strength. It's the ability to see beyond short-term gains to build trust and community. The families you've crushed could have been allies. He ran a hand through his hair. I started out with nothing. I watched my father break his back and still lose our original ranch. I vowed never to be at the mercy of another man's whim. Maybe I went too far. The silver pendant around his neck felt heavier with each word. Ivy set two mismatched cups on the small dining table. She offered him one, then sank into a chair opposite. You've built a fortress of land and money, but it hasn't made you happy. Maybe you built those walls because deep down you feared no one would truly love you if they saw your ambition. It was simpler to push everyone away. He clasped the pendant, recalling Sylvia's final attempt to show him a better path. If you were just an onlooker, why stay for 15 years? A sad smile curved Ivy's lips. Partly to honor Sylvia. She died with faith that someday you'd remember who you were before greed consumed you. I suppose I hoped to see glimpses of that man to understand whether she was wrong to believe. Grant's gaze dropped. And do you believe she was wrong? Ivy hesitated. No. I think the young man who wrote those letters never disappeared entirely. He's just buried. You let your heartbreak and ambition rule you. But that doesn't have to be the end of your story. For the first time in decades, Grant felt a spark of genuine hope mingle with the guilt seething in his chest. How do I begin? He asked, voice trembling. By doing what Sylvia tried to do. Ivy replied softly, heal the damage done. Start with small acts of mercy, then bigger changes like revisiting the Reyes family's mortgage. Help them instead of foreclosing. Stand up for the people you once exploited. One step at a time until you become a man who can carry Sylvia's memory without shame. Grant let out a shuddering breath. The road ahead loomed daunting, but as he cradled his coffee cup, he felt a curious lightness. For too long, he'd allowed sorrow to metastasize into cruelty. Perhaps it was time to channel it into something else, something that Sylvia had dreamed for him all along. In the ensuing weeks, rumors of Grant Morgan's transformation spread through the territory like a desert rain on parched soil. Ranchers he once threatened with foreclosure found themselves receiving unexpected reprieves. The Reyes family in particular woke one morning to discover new loan terms pinned to their fence post. Fair and achievable, with a personal note from Grant, apologizing for past wrongs. Disbelief mingled with relief, and they soon shared the news. The frost baron was melting. Grant did not act alone. Ivy Parker, no longer relegated to silent housekeeping, stood by his side, guiding him through records of families impacted by his earlier aggression. They both worked through nights in the old Thompson house, which they were gradually restoring in memory of Sylvia. The roof was patched, floors were swept, and one of the parlors was converted into a community meeting room. In that parlor, Grant spread out a large map relabeling properties, not by how much they were worth in gold, but by the families who lived there and the challenges they faced. Some folks called it a publicity stunt or a cunning pivot to dominate the local markets again. Others whispered that Ivy had bewitched him with an enchantment as old as the moon. But as the days turned into weeks, tangible acts of generosity quieted the critics. Grant paid for new well diggings on struggling ranches, freed numerous families from crippling debt, and reorganized his entire operation to ensure cooperation rather than competition. One night, Clayton Summers, the ranch hand he had once fired, received an unexpected invitation to return and manage the stable. Grant personally visited the old man, offering him the silver button engraved with the Morgan brand. I was wrong, Clayton, he confessed, voice catching. My father trusted you, and so should I. Help me rebuild the ranch into a place of welcome. Not fear. Tears welled in the old ranch hand's eyes as he accepted reuniting him with the land he had served for decades. But not everyone believed in redemption. Skeptical eyes watched from local saloons and bank offices, awaiting the inevitable slip that would prove Grant's newfound kindness was a ruse. Meanwhile, Russell Moore, an elderly neighbor whose ranch once bordered the Morgans, approached Grant with a guarded expression. Heard you're letting folks off their debts, Russell said, arms crossed. Heard you even wrote a mercy clause into new contracts so nobody can be evicted with less than 2 months' notice. Grant nodded. Sylvia believed land barons and ranchers should stand together, not tear each other down. I'm trying to honor that. Russell's voice was laced with sarcasm. So you want me to believe that a man can do a complete about-face after decades of stomping on folks for profit? Grant steadied himself, recalling the heartbreak etched in those love letters. People can change when they realize all their wealth is worthless if it's built on sorrow. He answered simply, meeting Russell's gaze. I'll do everything in my power to prove it. Standing at a short distance, Ivy observed the exchange, clutching a box of freshly printed loan modifications. She felt pride stir in her chest. This was the man Sylvia loved, the one whose letters had once promised to transform the land with decency and generosity. They were finally making that dream real. Back at the mansion, now bustling with more friendly activity than Ivy had ever seen, Grant cleared out entire rooms to create a communal kitchen and a small library open to ranch hands and neighbors. Each night they convened under the centuries-old oak tree for potluck dinners and storytelling sessions. Children ran across the same grass that once felt as sterile and forbidden as a fortress courtyard. Watching them, Grant touched the silver pendant around his neck, an emblem no longer of regret, but of how one life lost too soon could still spark unstoppable hope. He glanced at Ivy, who smiled back at him with understanding. This new path would be fraught with challenges. But for the first time in 25 years, Grant Morgan believed that building real prosperity rooted in compassion, rather than dominance, was worth more than any gold-laced ledger he once so jealously guarded. Looking back, it's astonishing how a simple act, stealing a small silver locket, could transform two hardened hearts. The lonely ranch owner learned that empathy and community could bring him far greater riches than his ledger ever could, while the once invisible Maid found her own voice by sparking the very change her employer needed. They each faced betrayal, Hard truths and long-kept secrets, only to emerge stronger and more hopeful on the other side. The lessons are as vast as the Texas skyline. Sometimes the toughest walls fall not to force, but to quiet courage and compassion. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did any moment in the story move you the most? Leave a comment and share your perspective. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of resilience, second chances, and the unexpected turns life can take. Here's to hoping every hardened cowboy might find the key that sets his heart free.